Wonderful. So happy to be back here, learning with my favorite B'nai Yeshurun community. And we are on our way, sort of unpacking interesting things about Purim and the story. And we talked about a number of things already. We are in session 5 of 6, so next week will be our final session. And last week, we talked a little bit about entering Adar with joy, which we do tonight. Tonight is the evening that begins Rosh Chodesh Adar, and for those who want to stick around, you can go onto the B'nai Yeshurun website, YouTube channel. You can find the recording there. I also did a summary video, which I can find and put in the chat at the end of our session today. And what we ended with, in part, was talking about how we can find joy, even small moments of joy. And I want to sort of pick up on that theme a little bit today as well. We're going to do something a little different than what we've done before. Every week is sort of a little different, which I think is fun and exciting. We're going to learn a tshuva from the Trumat HaDeshen, and I'll explain what I just said out loud in English. And I want to give credit that this source sheet, I've remade the source sheet, but this source sheet was produced by one of my rabbis, Rabbi Aaron Alexander, who's a local here in DC. He is the co-senior rabbi at Addis Israel in Washington, D.C. He's actually on sabbatical right now. This was a source sheet he prepared a number of years ago that I thought was perfect for our conversation, and so I bring it to you. And so while I certainly have learned it, and I'm excited for us to learn it together, there is certainly wisdom here that I don't yet know. Through our experience, we will learn it together. And the Trumat HaDeshen responsa is there are different forms of halachic literature, and we can roughly put them into two categories. You have codes and court law, if you will, sort of. Like in American jurisprudence, if you will, we've got the tax code tells you what the rules are, and then it's mediated through the courts in terms of what does it actually mean. Jewish law has a similar system in the sense that there are halachic codes that have been produced, and that when those codes hit reality, you got to go to your rabbi to ask for some clarification. Well, what do I do about X, Y, and Z? And I'll give you a terrible example. There's a relatively famous Hasidic story. It's famous to me. Maybe it's not famous to anyone else. So in my perspective of one, it's famous to me, that a person comes to the Hasidic Rebbe and says, can I make Kiddush? Can I do the Friday night blessings over milk? The Rebbe sits and he thinks. He says, yes, I think you can. And the guy leaves. His wife comes out from the other room and says, what are you talking about? Of course you can't do Kiddush on milk. I can't believe you said yes to him. And the Rebbe says, if he's asking about making Kiddush on milk, he certainly cannot afford wine. That the circumstances of the law and the actual human encounters make a difference. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone should make Kiddush over milk. That's not the rule. Please don't do that. But that interhuman interaction of like, okay, well, what does it mean when two things come into conflict? That is what's responsa literature. That's this court category is in Jewish law. It's called responsa. It's called shut literature, shutim, which stands for she'elot and tshuvot, questions and answers. Tshuvot is the category. And so we're going to learn a tshuva of the Trumat HaDeshen, Rabbi Moshe Isserlein, and we can talk about who he is a little bit later. He was very interesting because he held sort of Ashkenazi and Sephardic worlds together. He was sort of a funny intersection of the two, so he had a very unique perspective, and it happens to be a favorite of my rabbi, Rabbi Alexander. And so we're going to learn a tshuva from the Trumat HaDeshen in the context of Purim. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. The way we're going to do this is we're going to start with the question, and then we're going to read some of the background material, because his answer is only one or two, one paragraph. So we're going to learn the background information, and then we are going to take a guess about what we think the true Madadeshin is going to say, and then we'll read his answer. Does everybody understand what we're doing? Yes, give me a thumbs up. Put one in the chat.
Yeah.
Use the reaction thing, whatever works. Just make sure everybody's still here with us. Okay. Awesome. Can everybody see this okay? Or is it too
I can see it.
too small? Is that better?
I see it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Did you make it any bigger?
We can find out. How's that?
Yeah.
Let's work with that for now. And if we're going to read it out loud, so it's fine. So once again, Rabbi Alexander has added a little bit of comments here and there to help us with it, which I think will be helpful for us. Can I get a volunteer to start by reading the question? And in English is more than fine.
I'll read it.
Please, Jackie.
What is the tradition to do assorted melachot, work activities on Purim, like sewing, painting, and others for the sake of joy on Purim? Is this a worthy, positive practice or not?
Okay, so let's unpack this question. So what of the tradition, like what are we supposed to do with this category of labor, of work called melachot on Purim, like sewing, painting, and others for the sake of joy in Purim, right? So what does that mean? So there is a category of labors that we generally don't do on Shabbat and Yom Tov called melachot, which are 39 labors, things like sewing and painting and building stuff and fixing things, all that stuff that we don't do on Shabbat. There is a custom in the modern era to avoid those things, even if they're not entirely prohibited. And so one of the questions that we've sort of resolved by the time we've gotten to us, but is a question throughout Jewish history is, should we be treating Purim like a Yom Tov, like any other holiday, where we're prohibited from those labors? And so the question that's being asked here is, we are accustomed perhaps to not do these work things, these labors. Are we allowed to do them if it creates joy? And is that a good thing? Does everybody understand the question that's being asked here?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some tension you can already see in the text.
Yeah, it depends why you do them, because for some of these things, for some people are work activities. For other people, they're sources of relaxation.
Right. The important nuance here is, according to Shabbat law, that sort of distinction doesn't matter so much. In the case of Purim, the question is, does that matter? Right? Yeah, David.
So I guess I'm a little confused, because I thought that, Purim, like Hanukkah, is a post-Torah holiday. We don't say Ya'aleh v'yavo, we do say Al Hanisim. And although you're supposed to hear the Megillah in the morning, as far as I know, nobody says you can't go to work in the afternoon.
Yeah, so here's the nuance to that, which is, according to tradition, you are correct that these labors are permitted, but there's a refrain, the tradition sort of guides us to refrain from those things as best as possible. That's the nuance here. But you haven't missed anything yet. Yeah, Sheila.
My daughter used to distinguish between anything that she ever earned money for. Like if she made kippot for friends and sold it, she would not, this was on Shabbos, she would not do it on Shabbos. That was her distinction.
Great. Yeah, those are
that's a result of Hebrew Academy,
that I can't speak to. But what I can certainly say is, right, those are the kinds of categories of things that that ostensibly we're to avoid. And if you're confused, that's okay, because we're going to read the background material and you will be more confused, and it'll be wonderful. Can I get a volunteer to read this first paragraph here from Megillah
Interesting.
5b?
It's interesting. The one thing they don't list is washing clothes.
Well, thank
Let's come back to it.
These are
Bookmark
for-
that. Bookmark
Okay.
that. Nina, please. Rabbi
Sure.
Elazar.
Rabbi Elazar taught in the name of Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi planted a shoot, new plant, on Purim, bathed on market day in Sipori on the 17th of Tammuz, minor fast, and wished to abolish Tisha B'Av. But the sages did not agree with him, for on the latter, apparently. They go on to discuss the last point about his Tisha B'Av option before what follows.
Great. All right. I'm going to pause you there. So we have a very brief story in which Rabbi Elazar is teaching in the name of Rabbi Hanina. Right. So Rabbi Elazar is relaying this to us, that Rabbi, which is the nickname for Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, he was known as the rabbi. Right. Next time we encounter him, we're just going to call, he's the rabbi, that he would plant plants, which is a prohibition of a malacha, not necessarily on Purim. That's part of the nuance here. He would do this on Purim. He would bathe on a market day in Sipori, which is a location on the 17th of Tammuz, which is prohibited. And he wanted to abolish Tisha B'Av. I'm sure he is not alone in modern era who wants to do that. But the sages did not agree with him, certainly on the latter thing, which is to say that even though he did it, the majority did not go with him. And in the Gemara itself, they go on to sort of discuss that Tisha B'Av nuance, and then they come back to the next thing. All right, Nina, keep reading one more paragraph.
And
Number 2.
regarding the first point, how is it possible that Rebbe planted a shoot on Purim? Did not Rav Yosef teach? That is why village Jews who live in unwalled towns observe the 14th day of the month of Adar and make it a day of happiness and feasting, and as a holiday, Yom Tov, and on occasion for sending gifts to one another.
Amazing. I'm going to pause you there. Right, so we have this story. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is planting a plant on Purim, which is seemingly problematic. And so the Gemara is surprised. How is it possible that this guy, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the leader of the community, right, of the, he's the Nasi, I don't remember how to translate, the president, I think is how it's translated today. I can't think of the right word in its previous time. How is it possible that he would do this? Because don't we have this other teaching that would seem to conflict from Rav Yosef, which Rav Yosef says, this is why people who live in villages, there's a whole debate about which day, if you're in a walled city at a certain time period, you do it on the 15th. Jerusalem celebrates Purim on the following day relative to the rest of us. Although, as an interesting side note, the city of Los Angeles is halakhically a walled city, but not a walled city of that time period. The conversation for another day. So that's why village Jews who live in unwalled towns, who observe the 14th day of Adar as Purim, and now we have a quote here, and make it a day of happiness, feasting, and as a holiday, Yom Tov, and an occasion of sending gifts to one another. Which is to say, in the verse 19 from the book of Esther, we have 3 words, and here I put them down here in the Hebrew: simcha, happiness; mishteh, feasting or banquet or wine feast. That's how we translated it a few weeks ago. The Yom Tov, and there's a Yom Tov. And the Gemara goes on to say, happiness, this word, simcha, teaches that eulogies are forbidden. Feasting means that it is forbidden to fast on this day. And Yom Tov, according to Rav Yosef, means it's forbidden to do malacha. Right? This is, David, this is the question you were asking, right? It was like, well, I'm pretty sure that that's not the rule. Well, according to Rav Yosef, it is the rule. And so we have this conflict. What is it that Rebbe did, right? It seems to be in conflict with what Rav Yosef is teaching. And the question Rabbi Alexander's asked us here is like, how could he have done this? How could he have planted plants when we know it's a problematic action? That's the question we're left with. thoughts, questions, concerns about what we've learned so far? Everybody sort of with it? Any questions? Anyone got lost along the way? Is it the walled city Los Angeles thing? You can ignore that for now.
That's what's turning out to be interesting.
Right. We can do that
You
another
shouldn't
day. It
have
wasn't part of
mentioned it.
the 6-week series. Okay. Let's keep going.
Rabbi, I
Yeah.
just had a thought, and tell me if I'm way off base. Part of the feeling of Purim is to not only be happy, but wear costumes, and things are hidden, and many people wear masks. So I was just thinking along the lines that, things are kind of tippy-toppy a little bit during Purim, and tipsy too, if you drink during Purim. So you can't tell Mordecai from Haman. So maybe here, this whole discussion about should it be a Yom Tov or not in terms of Malacha. So maybe am I close? Is it sort of along the same lines, turning it up on its head, kind of?
As my teacher, Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, used to say, no, but it's a great midrash. Which is to say, that's not where the direction of the Gemara goes, but that's such a cool idea, right? Which is like, it's a holiday, so it should be X, but because this holiday is all about flipping X and Y, it's actually Y. It's such a cool idea. It's not where the Gemara goes, but
Okay.
I love that premise here. So awesome! I'm so glad you shared it. No, they're going to get really caught up on this Yom Tov word here, but I love the thinking. Really, really good, very good rabbinic thinking here. So we have this dilemma, right? Which is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has done a thing that seems to be a problem. The question is like, what happens? What do we do now? And we're here. This is all background information here for our discussion. All right, can I get a volunteer to read? Went on the wrong page. Number 3 here. Can I get a volunteer to read number 3 for us?
Read again.
Sure, Jackie, go for it.
Rabbi, the son of Rabbi, taught, one could even claim that Rabbi planted on the very day he was observing Purim, whether the 14th or the 15th, and that this was a permitted act. Why? Because the Jews accepted upon themselves in the book of Esther the prohibitions to not eulogize or fast, but did not accept upon themselves the prohibition of melacha. In the first verse, it says happiness, feasting, and Yom Tov. And in the next verse, on the same topic, it is written, make them days of feasting and happiness. But it is not written Yom Tov.
Amazing.
This is very interesting. This is really the basis of law. In other words, you don't have a comma. I'm talking about any law. You leave out a comma, changes its meaning.
So Sheila, will you explain to me what happened? What's the argument that Rabbah is making here?
It doesn't mention Yom Tov. If it doesn't mention Yom Tov, then we don't have to deal with it. Now, if it were the American Constitution, we would have to have an amendment. I mean, this is what's going on with the Constitution. What it doesn't say means that it's permitted, but does it mean it's permitted, or did they just forget about it?
So there's a tremendous overlap in terms of constitutional law and how rabbinic law function. They're not the same, but there's a ton of overlap in terms of modalities, methodologies. So here, just to translate it, right? Rabbah is making the argument that regardless of which day he was, right? There was a whole question here, all right? Maybe he was like in a village and not in Jerusalem, whatever. He basically says, regardless of where he was, it was permitted. Why? Because one verse it says Yom Tov and the other verse it doesn't. And because it's not in the second place, therefore, it's not officially one of the 3 rules here. We got happiness, which means eulogies are forbidden, feasting, which means you can't fast, and the Yom Tov thing, not official, not part of the list of rules, according to Rabbah. David, I saw your hand up. I'm sorry if I just said.
What I was going to say, you pretty much just said.
Okay,
So
anything you want to
thank you.
add? Okay, right. So just by way of summary, that's the dilemma, right? So now we have two arguments here. Doesn't make Rav Yosef or Rabbah right or wrong. We've got two arguments here, sort of proving the case, which is, did he do something permitted or forbidden? Okay. Sorry, the spacing is a little wonky. Can I get another volunteer to read number 4 for us?
I guess I'll read.
Please.
If this is the case that work is permitted based on this drash, why did Rav curse a man for sowing flax on Purim? We skipped this earlier, but essentially, how does this new permission account for others seeing it as forbidden? Something doesn't jibe.
Let me just pause, right? There's a section in between this that we skipped here, which is to say that we have another scenario in which Rav, a different rabbi, curses someone for doing effectively exactly the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which this person was sowing flax seeds or whatever. And according to the story, Rav curses him and it doesn't grow. Right, the plants doesn't grow. So here we've got this thing. Well, why is it okay if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi does it, and it's not okay because of this story with Rav? Again, this conflict is deepening in terms of what's okay and what's not okay. Okay, keep going.
Because it is a case of things permitted, though others act as if they are forbidden. But in Rebbe's place, it was not the practice to treat malacha as forbidden on Purim.
I love it. I love it. This is like the same thing with chicken parmesan, right? It's like every place does it a little differently, right? And where Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was, like people did malacha on Purim and it was fine. Where Rav was, not so much, right? Context is everything. The chicken parmesan thing is that there was, I've forgotten who it was, Rabbi Yeshua, I think. I forgot it off the top of my head. Who he ate chicken, poultry, and dairy together. And the rabbi said, well, we're not going to stop him from doing it, but it's not allowed.
So just for the sake of clarity, so Rav is in Bavel and Rebbe was in Eretz Yisrael.
I think that sounds right. I think that's right. We should be very careful. I don't think we should apply that broader. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned it, but I don't know that we should apply like this was the rule in Bavel and this was the rule in Israel and make that as standard. Like, I don't know that that's standard. Certainly the argument being made here by the Gemara is context and location matter. And therefore, in one place it was permitted, in one place it was prohibited, and that resolves our problem, right? We had a problem because the rules seem to say two different things. It's like, no. Everybody's got their own rule and depending on location, and therefore it's fine.
Just like rice on Pesach.
Kind of like rice on Pesach. Like there's personal custom, family custom, community custom, and those are legitimate things. Great, Jackie.
What it sounds like it's basically saying is that Rebbe did not treat, when he was planting something, that was an enjoyment for him and not considered a malacha. You can say the same thing about, I mean, people feel that way. They're doing this because this is their enjoyment. If you're decorating the table for Purim, you might have to you would do malacha actually.
So you're jumping to the end, and that's okay.
And I don't have it in front of me.
That's okay. We haven't gotten yet to intention, which is what you're talking about yet. We haven't gotten to that factor yet. And let's read one more paragraph, and then the question will be, what do we think the True Manadeshan is going to say? Right? Because True Manadeshan is the one who's been asked about intention, but the Gemara doesn't do that yet. Sheila, why don't you read this last paragraph for us, number 5.
Alternatively, people really did practice a prohibition of malacha on Purim in the place Rabbi lived, but he planted for the sake of happiness. As it is taught in the Mishnah, if these fasts for drought passed and it didn't rain, that is, they weren't answered, they ought to engage in less commerce, less construction, less planting, fewer engagements and marriages. And the Baraita on this Mishnah explained the construction as construction for happiness, planting for happiness. What's considered construction for happiness? Building a wedding home for a child. What is considered planting for happiness? Planting plants, that's something. Planting plants that will provide shade for a gazebo type thing.
Awesome.
So which is it? Fully permitted, forbidden in certain places due to local practice, but with exceptions for activities of joy?
Great. So here the Gemara gives us another problem, which is actually, and the phrasing is Ibaye Ema. It's like offering an alternative. So here's one solution. Ibaye Ema is offering another parallel solution, which is translated here as alternatively, right? It's like, well, actually, where Rebbe lived, it was also the rule not to do malacha. So he's not saved by location. And we have the Mishnah, and I'm glad David brought us a geography here, right? Also in the land of Israel, right? Has this whole thing about fasts, which is to say, if you fast, which is most commonly in the rabbinic literature as an activity for rain, as opposed to mourning like Tisha B'Av, right? You would fast as a way of praying for rain. The whole Masechet tractate of Ta'anit is like thematically around those lines. That basically, if you fasted and it didn't rain, you would engage less in all of these things. But there was some sort of carve out for this exception for happiness, right? Which is being translated here, building something for building a wedding home for a child would be something joy inducing here, and something planting potentially could be in that category. And here is such a funny thing that we have this like gazebo type, maybe it's like a willow kind of planting thing here, or who knows. And the question that Sheila sort of asked us before we read this paragraph, right? It's like, if you love gardening, can you do that? So the question
you
is
also have, for example, if you're not allowed to sow because of malacha, but for happiness, your hem is down or something and you have to fix it, then is that a malacha?
that is the question.
On Shabbos, you wouldn't do it.
We're not talking about Shabbos. We're
I
talking
know,
about
but
Purim.
on Purim,
So that's the question. What do people think? I'm going to go back to the question.
I think a lot of women, for example, Orthodox women, do not do laundry on these yontifs and I think during Sukkot they don't do.
There are a number of customs.
Yeah,
Certainly.
in other words, and you wonder, is it a custom they've accepted because, okay, this gives me a day off from that, or because it's the law? And did the men rabbi, this was really a case of sexism in some of these laws.
Yes, I would agree. Let's keep this broad, but I agree with you. Do we think the true Madadeshin, we don't know that much about him, but based on the sort of same source material, how would we answer, or how might you answer this question? Is this permitted or forbidden? Is there a happiness exception?
I think it's perhaps that Rabbi is also trying to be more liberal to allow people a chance to do things that they need to do. In other words, yeah, he's doing a shoot on Purim, a planting.
Right, need is not the factor.
But what if
No, but
there's a woman who likes to embroider? That's a type of sewing. She's doing something she enjoys doing, embroidering. But
so so Jackie, would you permit that based on what we learned?
Yes.
It depends where I am.
Okay, so you're making the location argument. I'll take it.
Rabbi, if you're following Rabbi, then yes.
Okay.
It's permitted.
Okay, 2 votes for permitted, and
but
then
again, today the rabbis, well, the Orthodox rabbis, some of them are machmir. They make everything more difficult, and you wonder what, how they would translate all that.
I can't speak to that. Truman Adeshin certainly.
I don't know what else they've become machmir about.
Sure, there is certainly an inclination among many, not just in Orthodoxy, to be strict, but that's not necessarily where we are. What do other people think? Where would you vote?
I would vote for it's allowed, but so far we have a lot of votes for it's allowed, so I'm prepared to be surprised that it didn't come out the way the votes did.
Fair enough. Anyone want to be contrarian and prohibit? It's okay if not.
We're conservative Jews.
I tend to be on the lenient side of things too, so I think that's fine. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, it's, regardless of the fact that, and maybe they're using that, the fact that it's in one paragraph and not the other, so that maybe that's a way to get out of it. I mean, it's a typo, it's a slim, it's like a slippery slope. Here it says, here it doesn't, but maybe enough of an argument. But if something specifically does not say that it's not permitted, then what would be causing you from not being able to do it? Now, in other words, the argument says it's not specifically prohibited, and so therefore, if it's not specifically prohibited, then it is. I think a lot of it, at least in modern times, from what I'm seeing from our community and from the Orthodox community also, is it becomes a minhag. It's different communities, different acceptances, and also I think a lot of it is defense building. Especially in certain communities where it may have been because of circumstances, because of locations, because of the work, geography, whatever, it may have been a lot easier to start doing something, and then all of a sudden it becomes something that really is not, I was going to say Shabbos dik, Yontiv dik, which it really isn't in this case, but it doesn't have the appearance of something. It's like if you're planting, fine. Like you mentioned, it's a context. People next door may say, "Oh, look, he's not abiding because he's doing work." To us, it is. So eventually becomes a point where the community say, 2 or 3 people were doing it, but everybody else said, it doesn't have the right appearance. So all of a sudden the community accepts that maybe you shouldn't be. So I mean, I think that's how a lot of minhagim come along, because it's so easy to go from one to the other and transcend, and then people start talking, and not necessarily in a bad way, but it kind of offends them, and so each community appearances can be very important.
Yeah.
What Larry's saying is the Maris Ayin is really what became. I mean, things that are in theory, like if you put on, we had a chazan, for example, who when he wanted to watch important baseball games or something, it was on a Yontivus World Series or something, he had it on a timer. But when you went by, you heard it, and you didn't know it was on a timer.
Yes. All right. So Larry, you added a bunch of things which I think are valuable. One is you made this great point that's also true for the U.S. Constitution. It sort of came up in passing already, which is the idea is like if it's not explicitly mentioned, like therefore there's not a rule around it, right? It's like left to the states, as it were. So I think that's really valuable here, right? Didn't Dafka say don't do malachot? So like maybe there's space. That was the first thing you said. I thought was really worth pulling out. The second thing is, you didn't quite say this, but I'm going to draw it out anyway, which is just because it says it in the Book of Esther doesn't mean it's officially a Yom Tov. Can it just mean a good day? Like a joyous day? Couldn't we just mean Yom Tov in the literal sense as opposed to the categorical sense? So the fact that it doesn't show up doesn't necessarily mean that we should have to do it. I think that's valuable. And then the third thing, which Sheila, you added to, right, just mari to ayin, this idea that seeing something permitted, right, that looks prohibited might create communal problems. So therefore that local customs exist for a reason is a real thing, and it happens in a tremendous amount. It's the whole idea that like, if I wear a kippah and I cut off somebody in traffic, right, I've created some sort of encounter in which someone might make assumptions about Jews on the whole. And it's a silly example, but on purpose. We could think of worse ones. And so Marit Ayin, this issue that people might see is a real is a real one, is a real issue.
Well, here's another example. With something like Chalav Yisrael. Well, I know some people who don't believe in Chalav Yisrael, but they observe it because some of the people expect it of them. They don't, in other words, they're not knowledgeable enough.
Yeah, I mean, there's like
all
there's
these
lots of
things like, you know, as I say, they've made everything more difficult. They've machmired everything.
there has been an inclination over the last century to get more stringent as opposed to the opposite. But I don't want to get down that road because that's not our topic. Any other thoughts before we go to what the Truma edition actually says? Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read for the first paragraph? Yeah, Nina, please.
Answer. It seems these activities would indeed be worthy in this case. And this is proven in Tractate Megillah 5b, which teaches that there was always a tradition to prohibit malacha on Purim, even where Rabbi lived. But in his case, he planted shoots on Purim specifically as an activity of happiness.
Keep going.
2, therefore, planting, even though it is a full-fledged malacha, it is permitted on Purim if it is done for the sake of happiness, and all the more so in our situation, even if one tries to claim otherwise, from the fact that the majority of people practice prohibitively and don't do malachot on Purim. For happiness, it would be permitted.
Amazing. Thank you. So we've got 2 points here. The first is these are worthy activities. Things that bring us joy are worth doing on Purim. Stop. Full stop. Even though in our Gemara text we have this, which we just learned, right? That this whole thing with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, even though it was prohibited because of happiness, happiness was enough of a factor to push it into permitted. And then he says something really important. Even though this planting, right, there's this idea that these prohibited laborers have sub-laborers, which is smaller categories. I'll give you the silliest one I can think of. And I say it's silly because I think it's silly, but also because it shows up in the literature, which is there is it's called an av malacha, the fully fledged category of no plowing. Right, so similar in here. There's an example that's often given, which is if I drag a bench outside on Shabbat and I've created a furrow by accident, is that permitted or prohibited? And the idea is that that's not really plowing, but it's really similar. And so therefore it might be prohibited. Right, we're not going to get into that whole conversation now. But all of this, even though planting is of this higher level, more prohibited category, it's permitted on Purim if done for the sake of happiness. And this is the part that I think is so important. All the more so. Even if someone tries to say, nah, you shouldn't do that, it's prohibited in this neighborhood, it's permitted even still for happiness, which is local custom does not supersede. If you find joy out of it on Purim, get at it. Do what you do.
Try it. Just try that.
Exactly. Yeah, Nina.
I have to also ask though, because I know, for example, at my son's day school, when he was there, they just had a regular school day after they read the Megillah. Sure, they had fun. It was different than other days. They dressed in costumes. They still had, a Purim spiel or whatever. But they also, and a carnival. But they also did some school stuff. So,
I think that may also
joy?
have to do with the Board of Education. Remember, we have other requirements.
Right. Let's put the
Hebrew Academy they had off.
All right, let's bookmark it for a second, David, because I'm going to have you read number 3 for me, because I think it speaks to that. Nina, you were going to say something.
Is it actually written anywhere for Purim to be happy and joyful, similar to Sukkot? where we are mandated to be happy for an entire week? Is it the same idea?
Okay, it's a great question. In the Torah, when it talks about Sukkot, it says, "V'samachta b'chagecha," be joyous on your holiday. So there's like a Torah verse, as authoritative as it gets, right? So that's category one. For Purim, there's really two contexts, I think, that inform the joy piece. One are the verses from the book of Esther, which is to say, it says they feasted, they were happy, they were joyous, and they made it, and they did that moving forward, right? So basically, they were an example, and now we're mirroring them. That's like category one. That's where the predominant, I think, support for we should be joyous, and then the literature maintains that. We've got 2,000 years of history of halachic custom that pushes us in that direction. And the second is that one line in the Gemara, also related to Tisha B'Av, interestingly enough, just like our Gemara here, that says, Misha nichnas Adar marbin b'simcha, when you enter Adar, you should increase joy. Now, interestingly enough, that phrase does not continue in the halachic literature. Could not find it for the life of me, for the most part. It's not in the Mishnah Torah, it's not the Shulchan Aruch, it's not in the Torah. But the premise of being joyous does remain throughout the literature. So it's not exactly the same. It's a great analogy, but they're not exactly, like, you've got a Tanakh verse as opposed to a Torah verse, right? So it's not quite the same, but certainly thematically, joy is like a good, high importance. Does that answer the question, Nina? Yeah, okay, cool. Yes, Judy.
So you started tonight by giving the definition of happiness, which is not to have a eulogy. So where does the rest of all of this come in? And then last week, I really liked what you were teaching about joy. The joy doesn't mean what we think it does, and it means giving to tzedakah, things like that. So I don't know why what all this is about malacha or not. It doesn't seem to pertain to me.
Great. So you are exactly right to identify that happiness is interpreted specifically not to do eulogies, which contradicts in a good way what I just said to Nina, which is to say, it says happiness, but we've limited happiness to say no eulogies. So that's like thing one. You were absolutely right about that. And yet, there's lots and lots of literature around being joyous around Purim. That stuff adds up over time. The reason why, so that's sort of the second thing you mentioned. And so, like, we're not looking at the book of Esther now, but if we looked at chapter 9 of the book of Esther, there's lots of discussion about them being joyous. They fasted for a few days, then they were joyous, and that it was committed to for long time periods. There was one of the things I was thinking about bringing today that I didn't, was there's a whole discussion about God holding the mountain over the Israelites to make them commit to Torah, and therefore we shouldn't be bound to Torah because we were put under duress. Can't sign a contract under duress, right? And the rabbis ultimately say, no. At the end of Purim, they agreed, and so it gets resolved. So, like, there is this sense that joy and commitment do show up. So that's thing two. The third thing you said, which is, okay, but last week we were talking about joy as giving for others. We're not negating that. That's still a thing. It was in the Mishnah Torah. The question here is, right, there is a custom of saying, look, even though this holiday Purim doesn't have the obligations or prohibitions of other holidays, people still try and avoid them, right? I mean, you guys, as we'll discover, right, it's like you still got to do your homework, right? Perhaps you got to pay the bills that day, but maybe you refrain a little bit. And so the question becomes, and I think the meta question here is, what is the power of joy? So we're not necessarily answering the question exactly, how do we define joy per se, so much as how is joy a lever that we pull, right? So using this example, transferring funds would be prohibited under malacha, and yet Dafka is one of the mitzvot of Purim. So you would say, if I put coins in somebody else's pocket, right, because I'm giving it to them, I've now transgressed a malacha, a prohibition. So how is it possible that that's a mitzvah? That would be another way we could understand the relationship here between these things. Which is to say that this is not a response to last week so much as additional flavor to the question of joy. Judy, does that feel like that at least resolves it a little?
Yeah, a little bit. Thank you. Because the idea of joy was we shouldn't be joyous because after all we killed people at that time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we didn't even really unpack that piece of it. And I think that's exactly, you're exactly right to bring it up. And I think last week, certainly, I don't know, I was feeling the news heavier than most other days. And I think it's a question that people are still wrestling with. So even very selfishly to say, I was trying to figure out how to solve it for Jeremy Markiz. Forget you guys. I'm joking, obviously. But I think the question becomes more sort of, again, meta question here, which is, how does intention, how do our emotions, how does the things that happen between our ears impact the stuff that we do? Like, that matters, right? There's a whole question in the Gemara. If this was a class on Pesach, we might learn that one, which was, if you are force-fed matzah and it happens to be the first night of Pesach and you didn't want to eat it, did you fulfill your commandment to eat matzah on Pesach? Does intention matter? This is sort of in a similar category. It's like, how does intention, in this case, doing something for joy, change the same activity just by what's happening between our ears? That's like the meta question here. All right, let's pause. Let's read the rest, and then we can unpack it even further. David, please read number 3 for us here.
However, I am challenged by the Ashiri's Rav Asher ben Yechiel citation of the Yerushalmi on the first Mishnah of the second chapter of Megillah. Quote, if one was writing, expounding, or correcting a scroll, if she pays attention to what she is doing for the sake of Purim, she fulfills her obligation for Megillah. If not, she doesn't fulfill her obligation. Yerushalmi, this implies that on Purim, malacha is permitted. Why? Because it is permitted to write a scroll, and writing is a forbidden malacha.
Okay, great. So which is to say, and this is why I thought this might be relevant for homework here, right? Which is, the Truman edition has a bunch of material which we didn't learn that he's like holding. And in the Yerushalmi, the other Talmud source, read the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, Yerushalmi is earlier by a century or so and is organized very differently. There is a line that says, if you're writing, expounding, or correcting a scroll, like a Megillah, right? If you're doing it with intention and you're paying attention for the sake of Purim, you're not just doing it, but you're doing it for Purim, then you have fulfilled your obligation for reading Megillah. Right? If I'm going through it and I'm correcting it, I'm fixing it, I'm writing, I'm expounding, all those things, I've done it. I've fulfilled the obligation. But if I don't have the right intention, it doesn't fulfill the obligation. Which seems to suggest that malacha really, there's like, again, this intentionality malacha prohibited piece, right? Which is to say, writing is a prohibited labor. It's one of those 39 things, but seems to be permitted here. So he's like wrestling with this just like everything else. All right, I'm going to read the end here. Okay, yeah. And now, based on this, where malacha is permitted on Purim, perhaps it's because malacha for happiness, specifically, isn't prohibited at all. For certainly the writing of a Megillah scroll, which becomes the essence of the Purim mitzvot, is considered more significant to happiness than something done for non-ritually connected happiness. Which is to say, we're doing it for Purim, and therefore it would seem to be okay. That's got to be more heavy. It's got to have more weight than something that's not related to Purim, but we're saying it's also okay. Like if they're both okay, this one's got to be more okay. And therefore, we sort of found alignment. Here's the final paragraph. However, it seems that it isn't necessary to teach it this way. Rather, they didn't accept upon themselves a Yom Tov, like others, forbidding work, as the Gemara teaches, right? This is right in line with what Larry was saying, right? Really emphasizing. For if they had, it would certainly be forbidden to write a scroll on Purim, and therefore the Yerushalmi ruling would be highly problematic. Which is to say, right? This is doing things that for joy is a good thing. Doing them from Purim is a good thing. That's what he says at the very beginning, right? It's indeed worthy. Even if it's a malacha, even if your community doesn't do malacha, even if we normally try and avoid malacha, it's still okay. And even though we have this other scenario in the Yerushalmi brought up by the Rosh here, Rabbi Yasher ben Yechiel, which I believe is his father, if I might remember correctly, right? Even though there's this other stuff that might make it more complicated, it doesn't matter. If it's for happiness, the same activity gets transformed from a dubious action, potentially like maybe I shouldn't do it, to something that is wholly permitted through that intentionality. And I think, before we sort of wrap us all up, what do people think? Most of you thought that this is where the Truman edition was going to go, or certainly you hoped that the Truman edition was going to go this way. How many of you are satisfied with his response?
I guess I'm satisfied because it seems like that's what is done. So I feel like it ratifies what we're, so to speak, doing. It's not to say we don't go to hear the Megillah and we don't change the day up somewhat, but you know, if I write it, you know, I have a personal habit of taking care of mishloach manot and also you know, gifts to the poor on Purim itself. So apparently this is saying, well, go ahead and do it on Purim itself. But I am a little confused as to whether we're hanging our hat on that it's about joy, or whether we're hanging on our hat on the second verse, not accepting it as a Yom Tov, and therefore the malachot are actually permitted anyway. Because it got a little confusing to me anyway toward the end.
Yeah, he says the first thing the first half, and the second thing the second half, which is the joy stuff is the primary factor. And even if you want to throw this complication in, it doesn't, like, we have this other out. So he's saying both. Cheryl, I thought I saw your hand up. What were you going to say? Cheryl? No? Oh, I thought you were affirming what we said before. Perfect. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think the whole purpose of Purim is to have happiness. So anything that adds to that kind of observance and increases happiness, go for it.
Yeah, certainly that is a takeaway we can take from here, which is like, if it brings you joy, do it, especially on Purim. Yeah, Nina.
Okay, this has been bugging me for years, so I'll get off my chest. Okay, all this happiness and joy and gaiety on Purim. Well, what about Haman? What about the fact we were almost annihilated? On Yom HaShoah, and whenever we remember the Holocaust, you know, it's with dignity, it's with sadness, and never again in the back of our head. And we were, you know, emaciated because of the Holocaust, but we're still here. We survived like Purim. But so my question is, you know, one of the mandates for Purim is you have to remember to forget, or you have to forget to or the negative, don't forget to remember. And that's always weighed on me. Why, when you're reading the gruesome part of the Megillah, the kids are running around in costumes and the Gregor, okay, I understand why we want to blot out Haman's memory and his name, although you do have to hear it, you still have to hear it, and then, you know, do your Gregor. It's just so hard for me. It's a dichotomy. You know, we're remembering a horrible period in our Jewish history. And Haman today is considered, you know, Amalek and uh, one of the worst memories of our existence. But yet the focus is all this joy. But during the Megillah reading, and you have to hear it twice, evening and morning, that's always weighed on me. How do you balance those two things? And then you're reading about, the sons when, I know you do that in a quiet manner, but still, there's a lot to it.
I think a couple of things. I think the answer is that we need both. We have days like Tisha B'Av that hold the space for grief and pain and overwhelm, and that's good. Like, we need days like that. And Yom HaShoah, like you mentioned, is a day like that. And also relief, joy. You ever get into like an almost car accident and like all that adrenaline runs through you and you kind of giggle a little sometimes? I mean, sometimes it's just like right? Like at the end, you're sort of like, yeah, that release, that relief. I think part of Purim is that moment. It's not that we're really being joyous. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe we made it. And that's good too. Like, it's not that one is better than the other. It's about holding space. We have space in our calendar to hold both. That, like, we had that whole classic story. The thing we say, people say, right? They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat, right? We have lots of spaces in the calendar to hold different responses to that. Some of them are serious. Some of them are mourning. Some of them are grief. Some of them are joy. Some of them are silly. And like all of that is good because like we're human beings and we need lots of different things. And some years you'll need one and some years you need the other. And I think it's just okay. It's okay to have all of it because we're humans and we feel all those things. And I think the juxtaposition of reading the 10 sons impaled from the bottom quickly, quietly, while kids are running around in the room is an insane juxtaposition. I think it's reasonable to say that's crazy. Like, that's a bonkers thing to experience, but so is life. Life is full of those types of moments of juxtaposition. And I think part of Jewish life, religious life, human life, is not the ironing out, the smoothing out of those moments. It's the holding of them both. And I think Purim, right, topsy-turvy, is a part of that, right? It's like, we're not pretending this thing didn't happen. We're also holding it and other things. Look, as a community, we don't talk about the last chapter so much, where there was lots of violence done by the Jewish people in that circumstance. Some years we'll hold that more than others, right? Certainly not the topic for today at 8:29. But I think the question becomes less, should we do one or should we do the other? The question is, what do I need in this moment? What does my community need in this moment? And am I having this need met throughout the year in other ways? And I think the answer is fundamentally, ultimately, yes. And I think it's okay to say, this year I'm not feeling that joy. I'm still feeling grief, and to have space for that. And that's okay too. And to also say, a different year, I can't hold any grief. All I can feel is joy, and I think that's good too. David, and then Judy, and then we'll end.
So I like everything you just said, and the only thing I really want to add very briefly is that I think that, and from my point of view, this supports it, but we could argue whether it does or not. One distinction, and it's not just a matter of time. The Holocaust was more recent. Purim is a long time ago. The distinction I'm going to make is a little different, which is, at least in our story, the Jews are completely saved on Purim. The Jews don't die. Some of their enemies die, but it's not like the Holocaust where 6 million die. And thank God we get past it. World War II is over. The Holocaust is over. And we get to move forward and build Eretz Israel, et cetera, and so forth. And the Jews still survive. But it's a different kind of survival when 6 million are killed.
Yeah.
And that might be the difference between a joyful celebration and a somber day of remembering.
Yeah, the sense of saved might look a little different. Yeah, I think that's worthy of holding too. Judy.
Well, it doesn't matter now, right? But I was just thinking after Nina said that in Cleveland we used to do. I know it's not done in Israel, but we used to do here in the same evening, Yom HaShoah, and then minutes later Yom HaAtzmaut, the same time. So they also went from this to this, but I think they changed the recent.
You mean Yom HaZikaron, Judy? Yes.
Yom HaZikaron, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yom HaZikaron, and then Yom HaAtzmaut. So thank you, David. So going from remembering and sadness to Yom HaAtzmaut.
Yeah. I think we I think as humans, every human's different. So maybe I'm speaking only for myself here. I think, especially when we talk about holidays and themes, we have a tendency to intellectualize the feelings. I know that I do. Again, speaking in the I language, I know that I do that. And part of the intent, I think part of what the holidays provide space for is us to get a little out of our own heads and back into our bodies and back into our hearts, and to just not get lost in the sense that like we lose agency, or we had that whole thing about alcohol earlier this series, but as getting lost in the spirit of the day, whether that's Yom HaShoah or Purim or Yom Kippur or Sukkot, regardless of what the theme is, it's okay to be swept away sometimes. And I don't think that that's easy. I think in our modern society, again, I include myself in this, we have this tremendous desire and need to intellectualize, to say like, okay, what am I feeling and how do I make myself feel it? That's the whole premise of the last couple of days, or last week and this week. And also, which isn't bad. And also, some of it is just being like, oh my goodness, I got a mishloach manot from a friend. That makes me feel good. And that can be enough. And it's like, I think we can hold all of that. These are the holidays and the mitzvot and all, they're containers. They're holy containers, but they're containers nonetheless. And we fill them with what we want and what we need and what our community informs us. It's like it all holds it simultaneously. So I'll end with this, which is first, thank you for learning this kind of complicated text with me today. We jumped into the Talmud and we had the Truman Adesh and all sorts of stuff. So thanks for that. And that the meta question of what is joy, what can joy do for us, what is the power of joy, what does intention do, all of that means something. It's not to be ignored. It's not to be put aside as less important, but that it's a part and parcel of how we engage in the holidays and in Jewish life. And this might be an invitation to face the holidays, to face those moments with perhaps an open heart, an open mind, for new ways, and maybe more difficult ways as a result, but perhaps better ways. Maybe not this year, but maybe next year. But to hold space for it. So with that moment and this moment of entering Adar tonight, I hope that there can be at least an increase of joy. Even 1% is more than where we are now. That it is an increased joy, and we'll see you next week for our final session. And thank you so much for being here.